Hello, welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast, the show where we talk to world-leading experts about how to unlock the full potential of those who operate in high-stress, high-stakes environments. I'm Martin Jones. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Mark Williams, an eminent authority on perception and decision-making in time-constrained environments.
The ability to be able to anticipate and to perceive what will happen in those scenarios is really the product of extensive experience in the domain and the development of knowledge structures in memory that allows people to predict more effectively what will happen next.
We discuss the science behind skill acquisition and achieving success in sports and other professional domains.
What is correlated with performance is not total hours in practice, but the hours expended in purposeful, specific practice with the intention of improving some aspect of performance.
Mark's research interests include the fast-changing role of simulators and virtual reality environments in training. Hi Mark, welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. How are you doing today?
Yes, I'm great, thanks, and appreciate the invitation to come and talk to you and your listeners.
Not a problem. As we were just discussing, I remember reading some of your research as a young undergraduate many years ago. Very influential in my decision to move down a psychology route, reading some of your work.
No, again, appreciate the positive comments. You're making me feel old, but never mind. Positive.
All positive, all good stuff. Can you start us off by describing your career, tell people who you are, where you are, what you do, and how have you come to be where you are now?
Yeah, in terms of my research interests, I focus mostly around expertise and its acquisition. Probably my strongest area of research is perception and decision-making. How do people perceive, anticipate, and make decisions in time-constrained environments, whether that's military, law enforcement, sport. Also interested in talent identification and talent development broadly, and in skill learning, skill acquisition. How do we optimize the use of practice time? How do we best provide instruction? How do we structure practice? How do we deliver feedback? How do we develop learning environments that will optimize the development of skill over time? So all things skill, all things expertise oriented is where my interest is. And so I guess I've been in this field for about 35 years now and worked across different domains, mostly sport, but I've had opportunities to work in the military, law enforcement, and even medicine and aviation as well over the last decade or so. And the last few years I've been working for the Institute of Human Machine Cognition, mostly doing sort of contract research work for US Navy, US Army, some stuff for SOCOM.
That's awesome. There's loads we're going to dive into. You mentioned decision-making in these high-stress situations, these time-limited situations. Let's dive into that. So if you are training somebody, if you've got someone who is in a job role where they have to make decisions rapidly, there's very little time to make these decisions, consequences of failure could be catastrophic. Where do we start?
Yeah, well, start with a common misperception, perhaps, in the sense that this notion that expertise in those kinds of environments depends on visual skill. And there isn't a lot of evidence in that regard, in the sense that where people have tested the visual skills of expert and less expert performers, there are no strong differences across those two skill groups. So the ability to be able to anticipate and to perceive what will happen in those scenarios is really the product of extensive experience in the domain and the development of knowledge structures in memory that allows people to perceive and to predict more effectively what will happen next. We know, for instance, that experts develop these so-called perceptual cognitive skills. So they pick up information more efficiently, for instance, from the body shape and movements of a perpetrator or a combat opponent in a military sense. They're also better at picking up patterns and structures in evolving sequences within the display. They use the visual system much more effectively, so they scan the environment in a much more efficient manner so that they can pick up the relevant information. And they're much more accurate in terms of their a priori expectations of, given the context and the situation, what events may well unfold in those types of environment. So these skills are really acquired over prolonged exposure to these performance domains, whether it's sport, law enforcement, military, aviation, and they highlight the very task-specific nature of expertise There may be some generalizable mechanisms and processes here, but ultimately expertise is very specific to the performance domain and the practice domain.
So it sounds like these things occur as a result of experience, that the more you do things, the more you practice, the better you get. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, and certainly with experience, these skills will definitely improve. I guess from a training perspective, the argument is, can we facilitate the more rapid acquisition of these types of skills? And then what kind of training stroke simulation environments can we develop that would allow us to acquire these skills more optimally? In sport, of course, there's a lot of money in that, in the sense of, ideally what we want is a 22-year-old centre-back in football, for instance, with the game intelligence skill of a 28-year-old. That's probably worth £100 million in the transfer market these days. Clearly, they don't have the same transfer market values in warfighting and law enforcement and aviation, but I think the principles are pretty much the same. How do we facilitate the more rapid development of these types of skills in these performers so that they can reach a level of competence and a level of expertise much more quickly?
The number of hours that gets floated around expertise and how long it takes. Obviously, the so-called 10,000 hours rule. And I know you kind of talked about this a little bit in your book, but can you just explain to us what the 10,000 hours rule is and how it kind of relates to expertise? What are your opinions on that? If we're talking about learning skills that people are actually doing these things in high stress, high pressure environments.
Well, the 10,000 hour rule is a bit of a misnomer, really. And it was Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers that inaccurately attributed that rule to Anders Ericsson, a very well-known, eminent cognitive psychologist from Florida State University, who I had the privilege to spend a lot of time with while I was there for a few years. And Anders' original work was on skilled musicians, violinists at a music academy in Berlin. And he did actually find that the most elite musicians had accumulated around 10,000 hours in practice. Subsequent to that, in several other studies, that 10,000 hours seemed to come up quite often. And hence why, of course, someone like Malcolm Gladwell has all of a sudden made it a rule. But I think ultimately it's not just the quantity of practice, of course, it's also the quality of practice that's important. And I think the typical number of hours needed to become an expert in any domain is very much dependent on the popularity of the domain and the typical hours accumulated in practice, for instance. So in a sport like football, which is across most of the globe culturally extremely popular, and where early engagement, if not early specialization, is the norm, then I would probably suggest that by the time these players make the Premier League, for instance, they've probably accumulated 20,000 hours in practice. In other sports, of course, which are probably less culturally popular and where early specialization is not the norm, let's say rowing, I mean, it's quite conceivable that you might reach a very elite level within a much smaller number of hours, 3,000 to 5,000 hours. I guess in other domains like law enforcement and the military, I suppose maybe the key issue is that, probably two key issues. A, it's helpful if you can accumulate more practice than those that you are performing or competing against. And of course, it's better if we optimize each hour of practice to make sure that we get the biggest return on practice. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been any specific research in those areas as yet.
That's interesting. I think fighter pilots as an example, and there's a serious constraint there in terms of practice. I've got two daughters. If I want them to be good football players, I'll give them a football. They can go in the park, they can play. If you're going to be a fighter pilot, if you're going to use specialist systems, specialist weaponry or tactics that involve a significant cost, because you have to have buildings, you have to have infrastructure, you have to have the fuel, all these things, the mechanics. So 10,000 hours, probably it's just too expensive. So, when we've got these sorts of constraints where we have to accelerate that number of hours, is there any research that shows that if you do certain things in a certain way that you can accelerate that path to expertise?
Yeah, Ericsson also differentiated between what he called a passive accumulation of practice, or what some people might call maintenance practice, and growth training, or what he termed deliberate practice. And what he said actually is that hours accumulated in practice are not necessarily directly correlated with achievement or expertise levels, because of this tendency for people to participate in maintenance training, for instance, where they're already working on skills that they've already developed. And what he argued was that what is correlated with performance is not total hours in practice, but the hours expended in deliberate practice, which is purposeful, specific practice with the intention of improving some aspect of performance. So he was very keen on being able to measure strengths and weaknesses, for instance, and then being able to ensure that you structure and implement practice sessions that work on the weaknesses so that you engage in this growth training to develop those kinds of competencies and skills. So I think it's important to differentiate between maintenance training and growth training, or passive accumulation of practice and deliberate practice in the context of what Ericsson was going on about.
Interesting.
And it's an interesting one. When you were talking there about, yes, the challenges, for instance, for a fighter pilot, a law enforcement person to actually get hours in really dangerous intervention situations that they come across, thankfully, relatively rarely, perhaps. It's difficult, isn't it? I remember actually having a fascinating discussion once over lunch with the coach of Lindsey Vonn, the American skier. And we were talking around these issues, and he said that he calculated or estimated that the amount of time that Lindsey had in performing or practicing under conditions that mimic the demands of Olympic competition was something like 9 minutes a year.
Wow.
When you're competing for an Olympic gold, it's a relatively unique event. It comes across once every 4 years. And the pressures and the context that come with that are in themselves probably unique. Other competitions may be stepping stones towards that, but there is a relative level of uniqueness in there. So yeah, in those kinds of environments where these scenarios come across quite infrequently, it's difficult. I suppose that's why there's been a significant growth in simulation training and the use of both simulators and VR environments to try and recreate these types of scenarios that occur less frequently than would be optimal from a training perspective.
I'd like to just maybe move on a little tangent onto simulators, because it just reminded me of a conversation I had with some pilots, with some military pilots, and we were talking about VR simulation, all the different mixed reality simulations that now they are encouraged to do. As we said, it's expensive to get somebody actually flying in a jet. Getting them in the air is pricey. So there's an economic reason to put them in a simulator. This individual said to me, as good as they are, the problem is you never experience the stress of something going wrong when you are actually flying. When you have to make a life and death decision, you have to put into practice a standard operating procedure to save your life. You never get that in a simulator. So how do we optimize use of alternative training methods like simulators to try and help people in the real world? Is that just a major constraint of simulators, or is there a way of tweaking them or tweaking how we use them to try and transfer the skills across into the real world, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Firstly, of course, the technology underpinning simulators and VR environments is continually evolving, and I think is getting better. I think the environments that we're able to create are more realistic. But clearly, they don't mimic truly the real world environments. And I think potentially the absence of meaningful stress is problematic. You know, there's an extensive amount of research evidence now that shows that pressure, however it's induced, whether it's anxiety, mental fatigue, physiological workload, influences the way that we use the visual system, for instance, to pick up information from the display, changes the gaze behaviors that we employ, changes how we prioritize different sources of information to guide decision making. So therefore, I guess the argument will be, well, if we are training under environments that are less stressful than the real world setting, then what are we actually training? Is our training going to transfer meaningfully to real world environments? And that is a real challenge. I mean, some of the simulators now, for instance, they do try and create some kind of anxiety, like some of them use shock, for instance, so you can actually simulate being shot. And we've been using Vertra with the military. I think it's a system that's also been used quite a lot with law enforcement. And you get like an electric shock, which is reasonably painful. So it stimulates anxiety. But no, I mean, it's not the same level of anxiety that we would get during real world interventions, of course. And that is one of the main challenges, perhaps, with using simulated and VR environments. So how do we create the kind of pressure that exists in a real world environment? And that's probably a lot of the experimental work that's been done, Martin, over the year, and I'm sure you'd be aware of, in the sense that when we might look at changes in decision making in a simulated environment under different types of anxiety or different types of pressure, I mean, invariably we create sort of competitive ranking situations and so on and so forth. But really all we create is a moderate level of anxiety. So if you're measuring anxiety on a 1 to 10 scale, for instance, you may get, without the anxiety intervention, a score of 2 out of 10, whereas invariably with our manipulation, you might at best get to 4 out of 10. Whereas, of course, in the real world situation, where threat to life exists, and we get up to 8 and 9. But clearly, again, it's where specificity of practice is important, isn't it? It is important for whether it's athletes or law enforcement officers in the military to try and be placed in those kinds of environments as often as possible to allow them to experience those levels of pressure and to try and play around with different strategies that they might use to try and cope with those types of pressures. I think that's an important part of developing meaningful and realistic training or practice environments.
Let's come back just a second around developing expertise. Some of the people that I work with, or the kind of the environments that I tend to work in, you don't often even start learning how to do that kind of job. These security, defense type jobs. Children don't play doing these jobs. You get to adulthood, you sign a contract, that's when you join the military. So they're only starting to develop this expertise, arguably at maybe 16, probably 18, maybe mid-20s. Do you think that childhood experiences transfer? Like, can you develop perceptual motor skill by playing rugby? And does that enable you to make these decisions in high stress situations in a completely different area? Like, what are your thoughts around talent transfer, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, I mean, most of the evidence around transferability of skill is either intuitive or anecdotal. The empirical literature on the topic is very scarce. There's very few studies. So the difficulties are we don't really know what transfers, how much engagement in the other activity, the donor sport, if you like, is needed for transfer to occur to the target sport. What types of activities, how many hours, and relatively we don't have answers to these types of questions. The only thing we really know from the science side of things is that transfer is more likely to occur the more two tasks have what are called common elements or similarity processing. So simply the more similar two sports, two tasks, two environments are, two professional domains are, the more likely there is to be transfer. But other than that, we know very little about transfer. And I wouldn't dismiss the fact that transfer does occur. What I would say is it's very hard to train for transfer because of the fact that we don't know what transfers and what kind of optimal practice in the other sport or task helps or not. Plus, I would say that maybe the degree of transfer that occurs could be helpful initially in moving across to another domain or sport. But ultimately, what the evidence tells us is that expertise is very specific to the task and the performance environment, and therefore specificity of practice is king. So I wouldn't therefore necessarily look for transfer particularly. What I do is try and develop optimal task-specific practice environments that allowed someone to engage in deliberate practice and accumulate more hours on task.
That's interesting. So there's no evidence saying, for example, if you play lots of rugby, you're going to be really good as a firearms officer. It just doesn't work like that.
No, there's absolutely no evidence of that at all, to be fair. And even in regards to, what could transfer, arguably, I would say the things least likely to transfer are probably technical and tactical issues. Perceptual cognitive skills, is not a huge amount of evidence around those skills transferring. Maybe, and actually this is probably one that you could answer better than I, Martin, in the sense of I can conceivably see that psychological skills could transfer across domains. Although, again, I'm not sure how strong the empirical evidence is, but attributes like dealing with pressure, mental toughness, grit, arguably could transfer from the military to law enforcement, for instance, or across different sports. Did you already comment on that?
Yeah,
you on the spot for a change?
Yeah, I'm usually the one throwing the hand grenade questions, but I think it's similar to what you just said. There's a lot of anecdote. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. These non-cognitive factors that we talk about, hardiness, grit, these resiliency sort of personal assets, do they transfer from sport into other areas of life? I think they can. I don't think it's something that happens without intention. I think you have to structure training so that these skills are brought forward in people's attention and awareness. They understand that what they're developing and how it can be used in other areas. So I think if we just say, a good footballer will, because they do teamwork, means they'll be good in a team setting. I don't think it works like that. People have to understand what they are developing and where they can use it. But I think, similar to what you've said, a lot of anecdote, not tons of high quality evidence that shows the granularity of how to do it.
I mean, arguably, in terms of some of the professional domains we've spoken about, one common area of transfer, I guess, is from the military into personal protection or law enforcement, for instance. And clearly there are elements or aspects of the three domains that are similar. So you would think that there would be transfer. Given the choice, however, between accumulating X number of hours in, say, personal protection to be a personal protection officer, as opposed to X number of hours in the military to become a personal protection officer, I'd go for the former. So in other words, task-specific practice always out-trumps transferability of skills across domains, but it doesn't mean that transfer doesn't occur. It's just hard to actually specifically identify what skills transfer. I mean, shooting of firearms, for instance, clearly is probably something that is very transferable. Shooting a handgun in law enforcement, personal protection, and the military, I would assume is quite similar on the sort of technical aspects of it. I mean, clearly the perceptual cognitive aspects of it would change, and the aspects around decision-making, cost-benefit or risk assessment will probably be different. That's quite an unusual thing when I think about it, actually, because in sport you don't get so much transfer, do you? I mean, kicking a football, passing a rugby ball, playing a golf shot, there aren't equivalents in other sports, whereas shooting a gun has a commonality there, certainly on the procedural aspects of doing it. But clearly the tactical, perceptual, cognitive context of when you may draw the firearm and how you might use it would differ between law enforcement, personal protection, and the military, I would imagine.
Can we pivot a little bit into practice? So we've mentioned practice a few times. Some of the people that I've worked with have very, very little time to practice, I think is the truth of it. They've got, might be doing quite complex skills. They may have spent a long time learning the skill, but then to maintain that skill, they don't actually get a lot of time to practice it. It's almost assumed that once you've developed a certain level of competency that you're good to go. How do people maintain skills? We talked a little bit around acquisition, but is there a difference in terms of maintenance of some of these cognitive perceptual skills?
Yeah, fabulous question. I mean, the literature differentiates between maintenance practice, where the drive is to maintain existing levels of performance, and obviously to develop growth practice environments that allow us to develop new skills. We don't know at all what the optimal balance is between those. Should it be 50-50? Should it be 80% growth training, 20% practice? I suspect that some of that may be task dependent, domain dependent. And even actually in terms of working out the optimal balance there could be a lot of individual differences as well, in the sense that clearly the challenges with growth training is that the opportunity for failure is much higher. And therefore, it partly depends on the coach and the learning environment in terms of whether that's supportive of the athlete or the performer. But I'm also thinking in terms of that some of these psychological skills might be important that we mentioned before, for instance, in terms of grit, mental toughness, resilience, the capacity to deal with failure, and the capacity to show that bounce back ability. You almost see the failure as an opportunity to learn rather than the failure per se. So there may be a lot of individual differences. What we do know is that in order to continue to progress up that skill or expertise continuum, then you need to make sure that you are engaging in growth training, growth practice. But we don't know for certain what the optimal balance is between those. There isn't a huge amount of research either on whether there is any sort of what I've termed skill atrophy. So what I mean by that, for instance, is that we did a study a few years ago in tennis, and we put these youth tennis players through sort of video-based, simulation-based training program to try and improve their perceptual cognitive skills. And we found significant improvement over time. We were specifically looking at how do we structure the practice optimally for skill development. So we did a post-test, then we did a retention test to imagine where the learning had taken place, and we did so a week after. But we also had a delayed retention test, which was 6 weeks afterwards. And we did find a decrement in performance between 1 week post-training and 6 weeks post-training, thus implying that there may be some element of skill atrophy. But there hasn't been a lot of work on that topic, so we don't know whether this skill atrophy is the norm, how quickly it occurs, and how frequently do we need to re-engage in training to make sure that we don't have that skill atrophy. I think it's a fascinating area.
Mm. Is it the same skill fade? Would you call it, is it just another name for the same thing?
I haven't heard the phrase skill fade before, actually. What I mean is just a general decline in average performance. We measured both the speed and accuracy of response in these simulated scenarios, and participants were either slightly slower or slightly less accurate. A general decrement, not to the levels that they were at pre-intervention, but certainly to levels lower than they were at immediately post-intervention.
Mm. So skill fade is a term that I've heard being used. Okay. And it's the concept of, imagine you're in a certain high reliability role in the defense or security sector, and you are given multiple tasks. You might need medical training, you might be demolitions, you could have some your basic soldering skills, navigation skills, all these things, but you're just tagging on training courses one after the other. Some of these individuals, it's mind-boggling when you look at all the specialisms and specialities that they have. But it's like you do a 6-week course, or you might be less than that, and then it's you are now competent to do that job. But the question of skill fade is, well, how does that skill atrophy, as is the way that you kind of described it? If we could plot it on a curve, do you get this sudden drop off? Does your ability to perform that skill just deteriorate rapidly, or is it a much more gentle tailing away? But the key thing is, how do we maintain the skill? Do we have to then retrain them every year? Is it every 2 years? Yeah. I mean, I appreciate, like you said, there's probably not a lot of evidence on this stuff, but have you, based on your experiences, what do you think?
I suppose that as a conceptual issue, we have to, envisage that in essence, learning involves a biological change in the system. And it's a little bit like developing a bicep at the gym, for instance, in the sense that if we want to get a bigger biceps, then clearly we have to have some element of specificity in regards to the training environment. Working on my quads won't improve my bicep. So I have to be working on the biceps. There has to be an element of repetition, and there has to be an element of overload. And that's the same in a learning context, in the sense that if you think about it, when we engage in practice, then we would fire different neural networks in the brain, much like our muscle fibers in the bicep. And that there has to be an element of specificity, there has to be an element of repetition, there has to be an element of overload. And actually learning, pretty much the same as muscle development, actually occurs during rest and recovery rather than during actual practice itself. There's a lot of neuroscience evidence now that shows that memory consolidation occurs post-practice in those recovery periods. Obviously, if we don't exercise the bicep for a period of time, then the muscle gets smaller. There's some muscle atrophy there. So I can see how that would probably apply equally in the context of psychological skills and components, because probably there's some neural atrophy to some degree if you're not using those networks. I suppose listening to you talk there, it kind of highlighted me quite a nice difference between sport and domains like law enforcement and the military, for instance, in the sense that generally in sport, these athletes are continually working on these skills progressively, always trying to do better on a day-to-day basis. And it's an ongoing process. It never stops till the day that they retire. The whole process is based around adaptation and development of skill. Whereas in domains like war fighting and law enforcement, I mean, it may well be that you do a period of training, you work on these skills, you develop these skills, and then you go out into the performance environment, and maybe you don't get the opportunity to practice those skills in those kinds of environments. So then I suppose there are potential risks there around skill atrophy or skill fade, as you suggested. Now you mentioned it's a fascinating area, but I'm not off the top of my head aware of any research that has specifically looked at that particular issue around how quickly that fade occurs, assuming it does occur, and what can we do to try and maintain existing levels of performance. To some degree, I think concepts of deliberate practice may come into it again, in the sense if we work on the basis of identify weaknesses and keep working on those. So maybe to some degree, in an optimal, ideal practice stroke performance environment, of course, people in those professional domains like the military, law enforcement would be having some element of practice and training on a day-to-day basis, or certainly a frequent basis, in much the same way as they would do in a sports performance environment. If not just to develop new skills and attributes and overcome weaknesses, but just to maintain skill over time. It seems to me that requires some level of exposure. What that optimal level of exposure is, I've no idea, but it's probably something that is amenable to empirical investigation, but there's certainly no published work on it.
Yeah, so any budding researchers listening who want to do this kind of thing, it'd be a good project to maybe look at.
Yeah. I just want to go back to one point you were talking about before, actually, in terms of those simulated environments again. The plus point with simulation and VR environments, of course, is they increase repetition. And I think for practitioners, coaches, whatever environment they work in, there's always a balance between repetition and specificity. Specificity to performance environments is very hard to get. So therefore, your opportunity for repetition under those highly specific environments is low. So then we have a choice. Well, what do we do? So we can create virtual simulated environments. Okay, level of specificity is not so high, but at least we get repetition. And it's that balance between repetition and specificity. When I talk about these in a sport environment, I do say that specificity trumps repetition. Because the problem is, of course, you could spend an awful long period of time repeating skills that do not mimic the true demands of competition. And therefore, the question is, what are you actually learning? Or are you learning anything that actually transfers to those environments? So I'm probably a much stronger proponent of going high specificity and low repetition, as opposed to high repetition and low specificity. I mean, in keeping with what I said about Lindsey Vonn and the coach's perceptions of the challenges of creating meaningful real-world environments, that must be a massive issue as well in military law enforcement domains, where even if you think about the concept of pressure and how that impacts on performance, for instance. I mean, in all of various experimental manipulations that I and my colleagues have done over the years, usually we manipulate one stressor. Okay, it could be anxiety, it could be physiological workload. And we obviously found significant differences in underlying performance strategies that are employed. But really, if you think about it in these combat situations, for instance, often troops are anxious, they're mentally fatigued, arguably they've not slept for days, they may be hungry, they may be cold, wet, or hot, depending on the climate. And obviously there's a significant fear of life. So then how do you deal with those competing stresses? See, essentially, right, what we know is that a single stressor, when applied in an experimental situation, reduces performance. However, if we have more than one stressor, the impact is not cumulative. So if we manipulate anxiety, for instance, then we manipulate mental workload, then we manipulate physiological workload, the impact on performance is not incremental. Because what happens is experts develop cognitive strategies that allow them to optimally allocate resources. So they learn to prioritize with what limited resources they have. How can I focus those to optimally perform the task? If you think about it, though, how do they get enough practice hours under those conditions without fear of life that allow them to play around with different solutions to potential problems and this trial and error learning? Okay, I'll try that. If it doesn't work, I'll try something different. Maybe some people only get into those environments once or twice in their whole lives. So the opportunity for trial and error and discovery learning is very limited. And that's a super interesting problem space.
I think it's unique to defense and security roles that sports coaches would never really deal with, because it's just such a different world in the way in which they train. The cost with a lot of this training, it's just a vastly different environment. But on that note, some of the work that I do is effectively a talent identification role. We're trying to find people who can do these jobs. Like you just said, that some of it might be individual differences. Some people might require less practice than others. They might be able to acquire knowledge quicker. There's lots of stuff that might differentiate someone from being able to do a job and not being able to do a job. And I know in sport, there's a lot of research focused on talent identification and talent development. So if we're trying to recruit people into law enforcement roles or into the ambulance service, paramedics, the military, all these things, is there anything that you think transfers well from sport talent ID into these sorts of jobs when we're trying to find the best people, and often from quite a limited pool? We're not talking population-wide here. We're selecting from quite a small pool in the first place. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, the talent identification research work over the last 30 to 40 years, I guess, has been relatively unsuccessful in identifying strong predictors of talent. There are some shortcomings in the research in the sense that most of the work is monodisciplinary. So they've looked at things from a physical, physiological, psychological, technical, tactical perspective. But we have very little multidisciplinary work, and we have relatively little longitudinal work, prospective type research work. And a lot of these measures, physical, physiological, technical, tactical, psychological, differentiate using cross-sectional design. So if we look at a group of expert footballers and non-expert players, the expert players nearly always perform better on these types of measures, whatever they are. But what we really don't know is to what extent these measures are predictive, because we've got no data that has longitudinally tracked the development of these types of metrics. So, by way of example, a lot of research work highlights that expert athletes, compared to their less expert counterparts, will score higher on aspects like grit, resilience, mental toughness, achievement motivation, perfectionism. Generally, they'll score higher, but we don't know whether they came into that environment with higher scores to start with, and we don't know how stable those characteristics are over time. Will they change more so in experts, or are they just going to mold for everybody, depending on the environments that we actually come across? So we're just about to start work with the Premier League team, actually, where we are putting in multidisciplinary longitudinal measurement to try and better identify whether any of these measures have predictive utility and how much variance in performance. Probably going to combine that with some kind of machine learning algorithms so we can better ascertain over time what the predictive variance of these types of measures are. I think it's probably even more helpful if those measures are also used within a talent development cycle, in the sense that if you've established some aspect of norms, if you like, in terms of scores on these kinds of measures, then clearly if someone's well below those norms, for instance, then you can think about what interventions we can put into place to develop those attributes, whether they're physical, physiological, technical, or psychological. Someone may be low in mental toughness, well, it doesn't mean that we can't put interventions into place that may allow the athlete to develop those types of skills. Ultimately, a challenge in sport, and this is also a challenge in the military, is very hard to predict future performance. How do we measure performance? In sports like the 100 meters and javelin throwing, then clearly there are clear measures of performance. But in sports like football, tennis, we know there are a number of skills, attributes, components, characteristics that contribute to performance, but we don't have a pure measure of performance per se. In other domains like the military, the problem's even harder, of course, in the sense that these people come into the activity much later in life. But one of the projects I've been working on in recent years, actually, is the US Army, for instance. They feel that artificial intelligence is going to play a big part in military combat moving forward. So then they have a project called T-Savvy. What they want to know is, how do we identify military personnel of the future who are going to be more capable and savvy in terms of using technology? So arguably you could look at things like previous exposure to technology, time spent in gaming strategies, for instance, whether they've got some academic qualifications in computing science and related areas. And then there may well be some psychological characteristics that are important. So I think that's an ongoing question in terms of, what measures do we take? How predictive are they? And generally, I would say the whole field of talent identification has not been extremely successful in any domain of activity over time. Ultimately, I guess the only way you really know for certain whether someone is going to be able to perform in that environment is to put them into that environment.
And even then, some people get it wrong.
Yes, they do.
There are some qualification courses where people are put into those environments for months, and sometimes they still get it wrong. It's tricky.
Yeah, we really need more, as I said, multidisciplinary longitudinal research and development on this kind of question. And I do think that all organizations should be investing in talent identification to some degree. However, I do think we need to be investing more money in talent development in the sense of creating learning environments that optimize the development of skill. And how do we best do that? In keeping with my argument that you don't really know how well these people will adapt and whether they can develop these skills, characteristics, or attributes more or less efficiently than others until you actually put them in that environment. So maybe our challenge is less so to try and identify talent, but more so to try and ensure that we create learning environments that are optimal for the development of skill. Whatever people's strengths and weaknesses are, that we can probably identify weaknesses and design deliberate practice activities that allow people to improve those weaknesses and therefore to continue to progress up that skill continuum.
When we're talking about skills again, just coming back to this question around skills, if we look at really cognitive skills like strategy, situational awareness, inhibition, go, no-go decision making, that kind of thing, are those cognitive skills, if I'm playing chess, the actual ability to move a piece from one square to another is something that my child could do, but the strategy, the decision making, the forecasting of what's going to happen when, that's a completely different type of skill, right? Are those skills developed in a similar way to, say, learning how to hit a golf shot, moving your body through space? Is it a similar process or are they completely different?
Well, it might be worth differentiating between what we call task-generic cognitive skills and what we call task-specific cognitive skills. So task-generic are things like working memory capacity, executive functions. So in other words, as the title suggests, they're very generic. They're usually measured using very laboratory-based tasks, a laptop, for instance. Task-specific skills are the development of some of the skills that I spoke about before, like ability to pick up postural cues, ability to identify patterns, knowledge of event situational probabilities. And they're very specific to a particular task, sport, professional domain. And what the research evidence has been quite conclusive over the last couple of decades, actually, is that task-specific cognitive skills are far greater predictors of performance than task-generic cognitive skills. I'm not saying that task-generic cognitive skills don't have a contribution to performance, but I think they'd probably be a far smaller contribution than what most people would think. However, a lot of time has been spent in developing task-generic measures of cognitive function, and they're quite often used in military domains. They're quite often used, for instance, in diagnosing concussion. But the reality of it is that experts are not differentiated from less experts on these task-generic skills. The expertise arises through, as I said, prolonged engagement in the sport and the development of long-term working memory skills, which are task-specific. And these task-specific skills can overcome any potential limitation, for instance, in task-generic cognitive skills. So I'm not a big proponent of measuring task-generic skills. I think we need to focus on task-specific skills. How do we measure them? How do we develop them? How do we optimize them? Whereas most of the work, certainly in the military, has focused on these task-generic skills. I think the reason for that is they're obviously much easier to measure, whereas these task-specific skills are harder to quantify, harder to measure, but more important to develop. So we have a little bit of a paradox here in terms of too much effort being spent on task generic measures of cognitive function, not enough on task specificity.
Just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should.
Yes, correct, yeah. So maybe we need to be more creative in how do we develop task-specific measures of perceptual cognitive function, for instance. And I think in some ways, I need to come back to this point because we spoke a lot about simulation and use of VR, of course, and I think I did make the point that technology is improving quite markedly and the fidelity of these simulators are improving all the time. But it's not all about the technology, it's also about the instruction systems design aspect. And not enough work has been undertaken to decide how do we optimize these learning environments? What instruction do we provide? How do we structure practice? What skills are we trying to develop? How do we put pressure into these kinds of learning environments? And really the instructional systems design components in simulation training is significantly underrepresented. Even a simple task like, for instance, in the context of learning, what you need to try and do is progressively increase task difficulty so that the learner is constantly having to develop skills to be able to get to that next level. And of course, there are numerous ways that we can increase task difficulty. So if I provide less instruction, the task is more difficult. If I do random variable practice conditions, the task is more difficult than blocked repetitive practice. Provide less feedback, increase stress, increase task constraints, for instance, having more opponents, less time to respond, are all factors that increase task difficulty. But which of those do I manipulate as the instructor? So I'm developing these simulations and I can develop whatever simulation I want, but what do I change here in order to progressively make this task more difficult? So a couple of points to bear in mind here, actually. I mean, there's a huge differentiation between performance and learning. So when you're engaged in practice, what as an instructor you will observe is the observed behavior of the learner, okay, which is their performance. It's not learning. Performance is observed behavior. In order to infer that learning has taken place, you have to measure retention, that is, that change in behavior is retained over time, and that it also transfers from that practice environment into the next practice session. And of course, the ultimate test of transfer, does it go into competition or battle or whatever the real world performance domain is? The reason why this differentiation between performance and learning is important is that if we want the best performance in that actual practice session, then the evidence is quite clear. Provide lots of instruction, do specific block repetitive practice, provide lots of feedback, minimize pressure. Best performance, right? Confidence is high, but how much learning is taking place? So the paradox is that optimal learning comes about when we look at it in the sense, what's the least amount of instruction that I need to provide this learner so that he or she can begin to perform the task independently? To what extent are my practice conditions variable, random, and dynamic so that they reflect the demands of the real world? And that is demands physically, physiologically, mentally, technically, tactically. So there's got to be an element of specificity. And what is the least amount of feedback that we need to provide? And can we create situations that are high in pressure? Because they're the real performance environment. So we need to stimulate those. And that might sometimes mean that performance in practice isn't great, but we need to be able to monitor that over time. So, you can see a lot of situations, and I think certainly with the US military, I'm aware of the fact that a lot of the times special ops troops are left to their own devices in terms of how they choose to use these simulators. So there isn't a lot of controlled instructional systems design aspects over them. I think that possibly moving into the future and in terms of that debate that I mentioned before in terms of how to increase task difficulty, if you've got extensive databases from multiple participants in those simulated environments, of course, then what you can do is use machine learning and artificial intelligence to actually optimize the learning environment so that the system takes over in terms of determining that for that warfighter, how do we increase task difficulty? Which of these variables do I manipulate in that kind of environment? So I think if I look 5-10 years into the future, that's the kind of learning environment that I hope will accompany the use of more realistic simulators for learning in those kinds of environments.
Fascinating. Time will tell. We will see. We will see. Now, Mark, I appreciate you're a very busy man. We've been talking for a while now. So we'll start to wrap this up. thank you first and foremost. It's been a really interesting conversation. I've loved it. I always learn on these conversations. I've definitely learned a lot from you today. So a massive thank you from me. Would you like to let everybody know, how do people learn about you, follow you, understand what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I've written a lot of academic books, of course. I'm actually working on the 3rd edition of the Cambridge Handbook of Expertise and Expert Performance at the moment. A lot of books around skill acquisition, books around anticipation and decision-making. Thus far, the only popular science book I've written, The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made, came out a few years ago. I wrote it with journalist Tim Widmore, who's the cricket correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. And that's a broad book around expertise and its acquisition, looking at sort of environmental factors that impact on the development of expertise, plus some of the adaptations that occur in regards to the development of perceptual cognitive skills, some of these psychological characteristics that are important for elite performance. And then the final section is more about optimizing learning environments to facilitate the more rapid type of acquisition of those skills. So that's an interesting read.
I've read it. It's fantastic. So I highly recommend it if you're interested in this area.
In terms of contacting me, I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm certainly happy if people want to drop me an email. So it's mark.williams@health.utah.edu. So yes, if anybody wants to follow up, ask any questions, engage in some kind of dialogue, very, very happy to do so. I think the area of expertise and skill development is a fascinating one that can make quite a significant impact in terms of improving performance across multiple domains, really.
That's great. The last thing we do on this podcast is I hand it back to you for the final words. Maybe something you want to reinforce. It can be maybe something you've missed or just a final sign off. So Mark, over to you. How would you like to wrap up?
So I'd probably say that I think a lot of practice, pardon the pun, around skill acquisition has been over the years based on historical presence, emulation and intuition. And I think we probably need to move more so towards the culture where evidence-based practice pervades. And I think we need to maybe reflectively look at an answer to this question. For every hour spent in practice, how much of that transfers to an improvement in performance in the real world setting? I suspect if we could measure that, we'd probably be quite disappointed because of some of the challenges that we've spoken about around differentiating between performance and learning, about how much time is spent in maintenance training and growth training, about to what extent can we create truly specific practice environments that mimic the demands of competition. But ultimately, wherever we are now, our aim should be to try and improve that, so that if we can get an extra 10%, for instance, out of every hour of practice moving forward, then that's quite a significant achievement. And creating an environment, I guess, where people can become more skilled more quickly. Or arguably that we need to then invest less time in practice by virtue of the fact that we're practicing more efficiently. And in keeping with that point before around the concept of 10,000 hours, yes, I think we need to accept the fact that to become an expert in any domain involves a huge commitment, generally massive accumulation of practice hours over the years. But it doesn't mean that we can't ensure that we practice most efficiently and make sure that we benefit optimally from every hour that we spend in that task or domain.
That's great. What a way to wrap up. Thank you, Mark. Again, massive thanks from me.
Pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in. And if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.